All right. Hope everyone's doing well. As we know, there's a lot of stuff going on. A lot of people are talking about Iran, given the stuff going on. I would just like to take sort of a second here to think about the arbitrariness that gets involved with what we consider to be ethical and what we consider to be political. Obviously, if we use the normative terms of political and ethical or the way we kind of use them, we will say what happened in Iran was a political move, right? But what I'm trying to get at is, what does it mean to be political at the level of this distance? Because what I notice generally is a lot of people express disapproval, and they believe that the expression of this disapproval is an ethical thing to do. It is what a proper, human being, care, and so on would do. But my issue with this, this even goes back to, like the Me Too movement, when we put black screens on. This goes back to the idea of, we sort of have constructed an ethics of immediacy. And an ethics of immediacy is always trying to respond, I believe, in some sense, to a kind of helplessness, right? We see things terrible that are happening, and we want to express our support and our care and sympathies to these causes and events. But what gets odd in this happening is that I believe that we confuse this with ethical, as if we confuse this as if we were ethical, as these kind of actions are ethical in themselves. That if you were a good human being, you would express support, you would express your disapproval, you would be loud, you would be disruptive to a certain degree. And that is usually my concern, because in my opinion, to be ethical, and I sort of borrow from Supanchik here in her book, Ethics of the Real, to be ethical is something way beyond than what we can imagine. To be ethical actually costs something. To be ethical does not even begin to imply something like expressing the approval or disapproval of certain political events or not. Now I want to make like a caveat now, that whether we express approval or disapproval or support of certain things, this does not in any way constitute as ethical or political actions. Primarily because the criteria for me is that it costs you nothing to do this. And because it costs you nothing to do this, we furthermore fear we sort of use this imperative that it costs you nothing as a way to also guilt and shame and reprimand people as well, right? So if you don't support, if you're not using your voice, this idea of the voice as a sort of like ethical tool, as a sort of call to action, has always been very interesting. because it's not ethical. It doesn't cost you anything to use your voice, right? Um, Now, some of the influencers, perhaps you might say, it might cost them something, but at the same time, we have to always sort of use the criteria, and this is my criteria. Any ethical cost, any political cost, is the willingness or demand that you change your own life, that your life itself changes. Um, you are no longer who you were after this ethical political act. That to me is the main point. Um, if you remain the same, well, we can presuppose that it costed you nothing, right? Because the one thing that we're all willing to do is we're all willing to sacrifice um, whatever it is that we need to sacrifice, except who we are. Um, Except who we are. And then, of course, it comes into another presupposition or assumption that we don't need to change because we are on the right side of history. Um, we are the ones that know which is wrong, which is right, and so on. Um, Again, I'm not here to debate about whether it's clear about something is right or wrong. What I'm trying to say is that this distinction, this certainty, this sort of knowing about which side of history you're on, is a way to obfuscate the real challenge of having to deal with the cost of changing your life. Because here's the other problem, right? If we feel like we're on the right side, well, then there's no cost, right? There's no cost in terms of there's no cost in terms of changing my life, because I'm already on the good side. In fact, it's the others that have to change. But this is the perpetual dilemma every single time, right? It's always the others have to change, not me. The others have to change. This creates a kind of gap and something that OG Rose and I have discussed about gutters, political gutters, sort of lines of scripts of conversations that we have, but it always kind of runs with the same presuppositions that the other has to change. I don't have to change. There's nothing about the other that demands that I change, precisely because you believe they're wrong, precisely because you believe. But one could argue that whatever conflict is existing between two sides is precisely the fact that change is demanded on both sides. The question is, and I think this is the question to explore, is what kind of change is between the two that is demanded? This is what people don't often think about when they think about political splits, Democrat, Republicans, or even geopolitical splits between two countries and so on. The demand is always that the other change. Never, it's never going to fall on me, and they also think it's never going to fall on them. So change is sort of the intermediary space that is demanded, and it's sort of ambiguous, I believe. It sort of escapes the symbolic order of what we think is the demand for change. I think the demand for change, I think conflict is the sign that a demand of change is needed. But the question is, of course, what kind of change? And I would argue it's not obvious precisely because there is a conflict, as much as we think it is obvious, right? Because in our minds, there's clearly a wrong side, a side that clearly has the wrong idea is clearly mistaken, and we're generally very certain. But the opposite side also thinks the same thing about you, right? That you are clearly mistaken, that you are also clearly wrong, and that you must change. So in this perpetual cycle of you must change, we ourselves refuse change. This is why the conflict is the perpetual cycle. But for me, conflict is good in the sense that it is demanding that we both change. The question is, and I'll just leave it here, the question is, what kind of change that escapes what is already being said? What is not being said in the demand for change? Okay. All right. Take care, guys.